Welcome to mini lecture 3 for Module 5. Again, quick survey in this one. What we're going to be looking at is the pre-colonial landscape of Africa and Southwest Asia, the process of colonization, colonialism period, very quickly, the decolonization movement, and then the concept of neocolonialism. So, again, remember that for the exam, make sure you understand the distinction between colonialism and neocolonialism. All right, here we go. So first of all, again, we're going to look at the empires of the region. One of the things that too often happens is that many, I guess I would call naive studiers of the African region think of it as kind of a blank slate until European colonization, and nothing could be further from the truth. Then we're going to very quickly just point out the slave trade and its impact, how colonization happened, the period of decolonization, and then neocolonialism. All right, so beginning. First of all, look at the landscape. One of the most important things to remember, we in the United States are often educated regarding the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, but it is worth understanding that the Persian Empire, so again, centered in Iran, is in fact one of the largest early empires, in fact could be argued to be the largest. And so the Persian Empire, roughly 500 BCE, is an extremely extensive system that integrated both Egypt and much of the Greek city-states. So again, Southwest Asians' culture is an extremely important part of our culture. So again, the Persian culture, right now, conflict with Iran, but understand this is part of our legacy as well. All right, so move forward 1,000 years, and what we see throughout the African continent are a number of major regions of empire. The West African imperial system, most notably in kind of my thinking, is the Wolof and Malian regions, but the Songan Empire as well, incredibly important, incredibly diverse trading systems. The Bantu states, a little less integrated in the south and central part of the continent, and then of course the Ethiopia region, again, a long history of very well structured trading systems, and of course, we know about all of the empires and states that existed along the North African coast. So again, not a blank slate in the least. One of the important ideas, though, and again, for another class, I wanted to simply point this out. If you think about all of those empires, incredibly important, incredibly diverse, begin to articulate with Europe, and unfortunately that articulation leads to the slave trade. And it is worth considering that during the period of the slave trade, roughly 1500 to 1830, 5 million people were forcibly removed from West Africa, from that Bantu region, and then again as far north as those northern empires. When you take away that many people, empires crumble. A loss of population crumbles or debilitates empire. So we have to understand that the slave trade is in fact one of the major players in the decline of the African empires. Now, once that decline happens, a few hundred years later, the Europeans do in fact treat Africa as a blank slate, and the Berlin Conference, again, know that, Berlin Conference, 1884, where the European states, European empires, came in and divided Africa, and it's a great kind of political cartoon here of Africa being divided up into slices of a pie and given out. And you'll notice that initially in 1884, a significant portion divided for the United Kingdom. Oddly enough, the Belgian Congo, a very strange divide based on a small port area, but an immense interior. And then the French West African. And so we see in this case, the Europeans essentially dividing up the pie. Now, this persists until, and again, you'll notice this is kind of the world picture. You'll notice that most of the world was very simply colonized. In the case of the African continent, it was much more complex in terms of its divisions. So by 1914, all of Africa essentially the pie had been divided. Now, what happens immediately after World War II, however, is Agitation for Independence. And in this, what we see, and I want to just kind of watch this map, the African states, as they were defined by the Europeans, moved through an independence period starting in the 1950s, and by essentially the end of the 1970s, virtually all of the continent had been granted independence or had agitated and successfully gained their independence. And so, again, a relatively short period. Again, you'll notice that we're almost there. We're up to almost 1970, and almost all of the states are independent. They have eliminated their colonial control, and they have moved forward. It is worth also noting that this decolonization leads to some degree a power vacuum, and democracy moves in, but many of the states become failed states or weak states. And those weak states are used for their raw materials. Neocolonialism means that a state is controlled economically, not politically. There's no need for a military presence or a political presence. And here's a great example. In the case of Africa, what we see here is that China is, in a sense, occupying Africa because it is coming in and buying so much raw material. What is interesting about that is the Chinese influence is gaining. So again, this is the race for raw materials. In other words, its economic footprint has increased 2,000%, and it's also increased its aid. What you'll notice here is that these two things kind of go together. China gets more raw materials, more resources, and it uses as a carrot economic investment and aid. So neocolonialism, give aid, get them to produce their raw materials, is effectively the same thing in many respects as the early colonialism. It just doesn't have the military and political presence. It uses the dollar, or in this case, the yuan. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll be back in the next one to discuss Islam.